Stop.
My lady, may I please call Mr. Boris Johnson?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I swear by Almighty God
The evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
the truth.
Thank you for coming back to help us, Mr. Johnson.
Absolute pleasure.
Can I ask you please to give the inquiry your full name?
Yes, I'm Boris Johnson.
Mr. Johnson, you ought to have before you a statement that bears the number INQ 000588008.
Yes, thank you.
Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And I think, Mr. Johnson, it's right that this was your fifth witness statement for the inquiry.
Yes.
Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
I want to start, if I may, by asking you about events near to the start of the outset of the pandemic, please. It was the evidence of Sir John Coles to this inquiry that when he read the witness statement of Sir Gavin Williamson about the preparation for school closures prior to the 18th of March, that he almost fell off his chair. What was your reaction to reading Sir Gavin Williamson's statement about that?
Well, I've got every respect for Sir John Coles and his views. I read Gavin's statement with interest. Was there any particular aspect of his statement that you wanted to raise?
Perhaps let me develop this and explore it a bit further. What, in essence, Sir Gavin Williamson was saying, and I hope that this is a fair summary of his evidence, is that he didn't seek assessment of the impact of school closures, and nor did he seek to develop planning for mass school closures because, and these were the words he used in his oral evidence, the steer I was hearing from, whether it was in Cabinet or anything else, was to keep things open, not about closing things. And he went on to confirm what he had said in his statement. And let me read it to you. The position across the whole of government in February was largely monitoring the situation, and there was no suggestion that the Department for Education should prepare a plan or a policy for mass school closures. It was very much a case of the whole of government waiting for Number 10 and Cabinet Office to give a lead and clear direction.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that there was no planning for school closures, because if you look at the sequence from February onwards, it's clear that SAGE is talking about the possibility, the Cabinet is discussing it in March, certainly. I remember the subject coming up repeatedly. And then if you look at the paper of I think there's a citing note from the DFE on the 15th of March to me for a meeting in which they go over all kinds of stuff that are going to be necessary to enact school closures, looking at safeguarding, looking at exams, looking at the needs of vulnerable kids, teacher training, and so on, free school meals. All of that was in there. So that indicated to me at the time, and I'm fairly sure I remember it, but certainly indicates to me now that work was going on in the DFE about school closures, and it'd be amazing if it wasn't.
Yes, but Mr. Johnson, that note was on the 15th of March, so at a very late stage in the day, correct?
Yes.
And what we're focused on is the period leading up to that and what planning was going on prior to that point, correct?
Yes. I'm afraid I can't tell you very much about that, except to say that my evidence from what I saw is that the work had been going on, because there were clearly discussions that had been taking place.
Could we bring up on screen, please, the witness statement of the then Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education, Mr. Jonathan Slater, and that's INQ 000 588 040. That's page 12, paragraph 5.9. Because Mr. Johnson, he says in terms, and we can read it here, equally, it would have been much better if Department for Education had been invited to start developing contingency arrangements for closing education settings at an earlier stage in the pandemic, given that no contingency plan had been prepared beforehand. But as can be seen from the fact that the first request we received was on the 17th of March, the government was determined right up to the last minute to keep education settings open. So, Mr. Johnson, that's the Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education saying that there was no contingency plan prior to that point.
Well, I think that it's certainly where I certainly agree with him is that the government was determined, if we possibly could, to keep educational settings open, to keep schools open, because, as the inquiry has heard many, many times, one of the biggest detriments from COVID was the loss of education, the harm it did to young people. So that is certainly correct. I see that he's saying that no request was received from government to do a contingency plan, but frankly, I would have thought that he is, as Secretary of the head of the Department of Education, would have picked up from discussions that would be going on from February onwards that there was work to be done in this area. And indeed, it seems to me that work had been done in this area, because, and I cite the paper I saw.
Well, we're going to come to that paper, but I think we have it in black and white, don't we, from Mr. Slater, that there wasn't a contingency plan because he says one hadn't been requested. Now, you may dispute the lack of request.
I'm not necessarily disputing that. I just think that it was obvious that there had to be consideration of closing schools. I was very much hoping that we wouldn't have to close schools. I thought it was a nightmare idea. But I think it would, I think as far as I can remember, you had other countries were starting to close schools.
Yes.
And I'm surprised that the Perm Sec at the DFE didn't feel that it was necessary to look at what contingency arrangements we had.
Can I interrupt? Would you expect, running the United Kingdom as Prime Minister, would you expect the Department for Education to wait for a request for them to develop contingency plans?
No, of course not. And I think that, as I say, I think that my impression from the stuff I read was that a great deal of thought and care was already going into some of the key questions. But this is what Mr. Slater he says he had no plan ready. I think that is surprising.
I mean, we've also heard evidence from Miss Susan Ackland-Hood, who is now the Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education, who's also reviewed all of the paperwork, and who confirms that there wasn't planning beyond the possibility, for example, of some individual school closures, or for the possibility that there might be staff shortages. So it isn't simply that this is Mr. Slater saying this. Indeed, that would be surprising. It's been confirmed by the department on their overall consideration of the written material. But one assumes, Mr. Johnson, from your evidence that this is all in effect news to you, that there was this absence of planning behind the scenes, well, correct?
I think that there was certainly, as I understood the position at the time, to the best of my memory, there was work going on in the DFE about how to deal with the consequences of COVID, and in particular, how to compensate for the loss of learning. And, the paper that I've mentioned that only appeared before me on the 15th, seemed to suggest to me that a great deal of work had been done on the key areas.
We'll come back to that paper, but I just want to be clear about this. Do you accept that until mid-March 2020 there hadn't been a cross-government focus on closing schools?
I think that it was a subject that had repeatedly cropped up at SAGE meetings, at SPIMO, all of which the relevant departments had been represented, and there had been, including DFE. So, no, I don't really accept that. I think that there had already been conversations about the possibility of closing schools, and it looked to me as though the DFE was preparing for that.
And I think that's right in terms of what you've said on your witness statement, and perhaps if we could bring that up, please, in terms of what you say at your paragraph 5. And I think it's suggested from this, Mr. Johnson, that what you're confirming here is that by the 10th of February 2020, it was already apparent or patent that school closures might be necessary as part of your response to the pandemic.
Yes, though the documents that I've looked at recently, and the SPIMO and the SAGE papers, and I seem to remember this also from the time. And one of the difficulties is my memory is now contaminated by what I've recently read. What they seem to suggest is that early on, the advice on school closures from the scientists was it was not not necessarily a particularly effective tool of controlling the pandemic, certainly not on its own, and that clearly changed as we got closer to the decision, and the key weekend was March the 14th when all that changed.
Turn to that, but do you accept, and the inquiry has been through the scientific advice that was provided from the 4th of February, that from the 4th of February onwards it was being advised by SAGE that school closures were at least in contemplation as a
absolutely.
possible?
Yes.
And do you accept that given all of that advice from February, and notwithstanding that it was not the decision anyone had wanted to make, that there had to be planning for the possible eventuality of school closures? Because the implications were enormous.
And what I'm trying to say to you is that I believe that there was such planning. What I don't think, and clearly from what Mrs. Ackland Hood and what Mr. Slater have said, they don't feel that there was a fully worked up plan for how to deal with everything. I can't tell you now why that was the case, but I can offer at the time, don't forget that we didn't know the effect this disease had on kids. We didn't know much about the transmissibility of the disease. There were all sorts of things that were simply unknown and difficult to plan for, and the thing was moving very fast. And from the point of view of Number 10, we were focused very much on trying to stave off, trying to avoid an appalling public health crisis. And we were focused on getting enough ventilators, on getting enough PPE, trying to avoid a significant number of casualties. And I think it's important for the inquiry to remember that at the time that the school closures were first mentioned, they were seen as something you'd put in at the peak of the pandemic. And we didn't think we were yet at the peak of the pandemic, if you see what I mean.
And I just want to come back, just sticking for a moment on when you your understanding as to the position about school closures and when they were being posited. If we go to paragraph 20, please, on page 7 of your statement. And again, you say here the issue of school closures was on the government's agenda as soon as it became clear how dangerous COVID was. I think that DFE and Gavin were aware that we were considering mass school closures of schools from very early on. Thank you. That can come down.
I think that's right. School closures were clearly going to be part of the panoply of things that we might be able to do to defeat COVID. I wanted to keep it to the very, very last. It was something that I thought was a terrible thing to do, and it would have awful consequences for young people, particularly those who were least able to cope. So, although there was consideration of school closures, and the idea was being discussed, and as I say, I think I can see evidence that this was going on in the DFE at the time. As a worked-up policy and plan, we thought it was premature. We didn't think it was. I didn't think it was something we were going to have to implement as fast as we did, if at all.
We'll come to the timing of it, but just staying with the potential the implications of school closures. You say at paragraph 21 of your statement that you knew when you made the decision to close schools on the 18th of March that the consequences would be devastating for all children, but worse for vulnerable children, correct?
Yes.
And I think if we can go to the document that you've mentioned, this document of the 15th of March.
Yes.
And that's INQ 000106221.
Yeah.
That set out, didn't it, in headline form, Mr. Johnson, what the implications of the closure of schools would be. So, in other words, and potentially the most significant of all, that 9 million pupils wouldn't be guaranteed to receive an education, and that any education they did receive would typically be limited, yes?
Yes.
That 1.3 million of the poorest children wouldn't receive their free school meal. That remote learning would not work for all, that schools' ability to provide it was hugely variable, and many children didn't have access to the relevant kit, and many children didn't live in adequate home circumstances or environments, and didn't have Wi-Fi. And if we drop down perhaps to the last bullet, that vulnerable children are much safer in school than out, and here pointing to the 400,000 children who had a social worker who might be at risk, and it says here from inadequate parenting, witnessing domestic violence, particularly if families are also facing the pressure of imposed isolation.
Yeah.
And presumably, Mr. Johnson, you appreciated too that below that threshold of children who had a social worker, there were many other children who would be at risk as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, that can come down. And do you accept that the consequences for children were so grave and so far-reaching of school closures that they were the responsibility of all of government, that it wasn't just a Department for Education responsibility?
Of course. And I should say that I take, because I was saying, but as I told this inquiry before, I take full responsibility for all the decisions that we took, and all mistakes that were made were mistakes that I am accountable for and take responsibility for. And insofar as we got things wrong, then of course I apologise for that, and as I've done before to this inquiry. I remain very proud, of course, of a lot of things that I think the teachers, the schools did to cope with this unbelievably difficult set of circumstances. And I think that, on the whole, they acquitted themselves outstandingly well.
Just focusing on that, on the events of the 15th, 16th and 17th of March. Can you explain why, given this whole government responsibility for the implications of school closures, why it was only on the 16th, 17th of March that, first of all, a paper was commissioned in order to set out the proposals or the options for keeping schools open?
I think that you've got to go back to the problem that we had of timing. And I think in my evidence to this inquiry earlier on, I pointed out that there'd been a great acceleration in the understanding of the scientists about where we were on the pandemic curve. And if you remember, so to the weekend of March 14th, 15th, it becomes obvious that things have moved much faster, and school closures, which February 10th and so on, the stage are saying are not necessarily something we'll want to bring in. I think even on March the 5th, Chris Whitty is saying it's not something we want to do imminently. It becomes clear that the spike is going up so fast that, sadly, school closures are going to have to be part of the initial package, and that's effectively what we had to do. I mean, there were other factors as well. The people were, as you know, the teachers were self-isolating, and some schools were finding it difficult to operate anyway.
I think what might be very difficult to understand is why, given the gravity of the consequences of closing schools, that nonetheless seeking out papers on keeping schools open came at such last minute and just before you ended up having to make the decision to close schools.
Well, as I think I've tried to explain why I think that was the case. We were focused on trying to delay the peak of the pandemic, and we thought that the closure of schools, if it had to be used at all, would be a measure of last resort. And lastly, it was my impression that the work was being done, and I certainly assumed that the work was being done.
I'm just focusing here on why at the centre these questions are only being asked so late in the day. So in other words, the centre is only asking for proposals to keep schools open at this very, very late stage, only to reverse the position within about 24 hours and to ask for options on closing schools.
Well, I think that's entirely understandable, given the immensity of the decision and the detriments that it was likely to have.
Does the fact that these questions were being asked so late in the day demonstrate that the problem and the failures of planning were systematic failures and not just failures on the part of the Department for Education?
No, I don't. Well, as I say, I'm not certain that the Department for Education was quite as remiss as you've said, and I think my impression was that they'd done a lot of work. And when you look at what was achieved during the period when schools were closed, I think people responded pretty heroically to the challenge. You say so late in the day, but so late in the day is, of course, a phrase that is only open, or a judgment only open to people who are operating with hindsight. We didn't know how COVID was being transmitted. We didn't know to what extent children and young people were affected by it. It was very difficult. We didn't know the state of the pandemic in the country. It was very difficult to plan for how schools exactly should respond. And it remained very difficult throughout the throughout the pandemic.
But you've accepted that the possibility of school closures was being posited as a specific step that could be taken in response to the pandemic from the very earliest stages
Yes.
of the SAGE advice. And you've accepted that the implications of closing schools were enormous for almost every school-age child in this country, correct?
Yes.
And you must accept that therefore put a responsibility on government to grasp the nettle and really think about what it needed to do if schools were in fact going to close to most children.
And
Yes.
as I've said to you, it looks to me as though that's exactly what the DfE was doing. And as it happens, the schools sadly did close.
Yeah.
And we did our level best to remediate the damage and to give kids the education that they needed as far as we could.
What work was it that you thought was being done in the background to prepare schools for the eventuality of having to close? What was it you saw that gave you the confidence that this planning was going on in the background?
The document that I've cited, because and maybe it was misleading, but it seemed to me to suggest that a good deal of work was being done on vulnerable kids, on exams, all the subjects that I've mentioned.
Perhaps we should look at that document then, Mr. Johnson, just to see what it says, if that's what your evidence is focused on. Can we go back, please, to INQ 000106221? I think if we go, please, to page 3. It sets out, doesn't it, a summary of some of the DfE's current contingency planning. So it set out, I think, at the start that there is some scenarios for free school meals, correct?
Yes.
On remote learning, if we drop down, please. We intend this week to publish guidance on the steps that schools should now be taking. Correct?
Yes.
So you must have appreciated that prior to this point, there hadn't even been guidance sent to schools in order to assist.
I do, but I think also the inquiry will appreciate that we hadn't had a pandemic like this for a very long time.
Yes.
The eventuality of closing schools was one that we regarded with horror, and one that we didn't think we would have to resort to until the peak of the pandemic.
Well, I think, Mr. Johnson, that's understood that closing schools would be a terrible decision, but it was because the consequences were so profound that it needed to be properly planned for, yes?
I think, of course, and as if you look at the document that we're studying, it's clear that they're going through various scenarios to deal with most of the problems that you can think of. They've got 3 scenarios being developed for exams within Ofqual. They're publishing guidance on remote learning. It seems to me that yes, I mean, I would accept that the reality was slow to dawn on government generally about the full horror of COVID, but that's something that we've been around many times. I think and you can see it in the way the scientific advice changes throughout the year. So they move from saying, put these measures on during the peak of the pandemic to saying go hard, go early. And there's a clear difference in approach.
Mr. Johnson, I'm just going to stay on this document for a moment to look at the last of the implications, which is that of vulnerable children.
Can you remind me of the date, Mr. Lee?
Yes, it's the 15th,
of March.
Thank you.
And as we can see there, in respect of vulnerable children and childcare, this paper doesn't deal with it, Mr. Johnson. So there's nothing here, for example, that sets out Department for Education thinking about child protection systems, all of the other support and services that schools provide to children, and particularly those most in need.
I think it's meant to be a short citing document. It's not meant to be going through everything that is in the head of the department. Look, I understand the criticism that we should have planned better for school closures and we should have alerted schools earlier to the possibility of school closures and spelt out in more detail what might happen in the context of school closures. All I can say to you is that is to imagine a much greater state of knowledge about COVID and what was likely to happen than we actually had at the time, and particularly a greater state of knowledge about the speed with which the disease was progressing. And I go back to the. I mean, yes, I think it's a fair point that this document itself doesn't look like a fully worked up plan for school closures, but it seems to me that the department was doing the work.
All right. Well, Mr. Johnson, we were looking at that document so that the inquiry could understand what it was that gave you confidence about Department for Education planning. But I think you're clear that this is the sole basis for that confidence, correct?
Well, there were plenty of other meetings and discussions in which DFE officials were involved when it was obvious, as you've said, that school closures were coming down the agenda. And it was always obvious to me that this was going to be one of the things we would have to consider.
I'm going to move on, if I may, to ask about the 16th and 17th of March, and specifically the evidence that was given by Sir Gavin Williamson in his witness statement, which you've seen and which he confirmed in oral evidence, that there was this discombobulating sea change, to which I've already alluded to, between the 16th and 17th of March, whereby the government's direction went from keeping schools open to overnight to keeping schools closed. Do you agree with his evidence that it was a discombobulating sea change?
Well, obviously I can't speak for Gavin about how he felt about it, but my impression was that everybody understood that school closures was part of the toolkit that we might sadly have to use, and we were being forced by events and by the spread of the disease to deploy that solution much earlier than we wanted, and indeed against our will, just by the spread of the disease. So I'm afraid the reality of COVID just meant that we had to get the R down below 1, and school closures represent, though not a very significant measure in themselves, they can help to get the R down below 1 at critical moments, and we had no choice.
Yes, so I think, Mr. Johnson, is your evidence that it wasn't a sea change, it was simply a speeding up of that which was going to happen in any event?
I mean, I'm not saying that it was necessarily going to happen in any event, but because things might have turned out differently, but they didn't. What it certainly was the result of a gradual and then accelerating progression in the disease, which is familiar to anybody who looks at one of those curves.
Thank you. Sir John Cole said of Sir Gavin Williamson's evidence about school closures that he thought that it was an extraordinary dereliction of duty. So he was referring again to the lack of planning for school closures. And he said it was perfectly clear to me, as someone who was running schools, that there was a high likelihood that schools would have to close. And we were planning for that, whilst, of course, doing everything we could to keep schools open. If it is right to characterise the lack of planning as a dereliction of duty, do you accept that that's a dereliction that's shared by the whole of government and not just for the Department for Education?
Well, as I've tried to argue this morning, I think that the department, contrary perhaps to, it felt to me as though there had been abundant discussions about closing schools, and it felt to me, to the best of my recollection, as though the department was aware of this, and I assumed that they were planning for it. When I look at that document of March the 15th, it seems to me to suggest that a great deal of work and thought had gone into the key issues. So I'm not inclined to accept the idea that people fell down gravely in their duty. I think people were overwhelmed by the speed of events, and when the facts changed, they had to change policy, and I had to change policy.
So you don't accept that the evidence from the then Permanent Secretary that there was no contingency plan for school closures, or there wasn't planning that focused on the potential for mass school closures, you don't think that that's a dereliction of duty? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I can only repeat what I've just said. I understand. I know that Mr. Slater later resigned. Though not over that matter, as far as I can remember. I don't think, if you're the Perm Sec at the DFE, there's nothing to. There was certainly no. Let me put it this way: there was absolutely nothing coming from central government to say you must not, on any account, prepare for school closures. On the contrary, anybody looking at what was happening would have assumed that school closures was something that had to be encompassed and prepared for. And from what I can see of the department's thinking, they were indeed doing that.
And we're back to the document of the 15th of March.
Yeah, that's all I have to go. I mean, I don't have access to any other document.
And you do understand this, it's not just Mr. Slater saying it, it's the whole tenor of Sir Gavin Williamson's evidence as well, that he didn't seek assessment, for example, of the impact of school closures, because that had never been a direction given by you or given by the centre of government.
Well, I think that's, if you look at what I said in Cabinet, I think on the 11th of March, I may have got my dates wrong, but I say that we will come under increasing pressure to close schools. And I was always grimly reconciled to the possibility that we would have to do all sorts of things that I really didn't want to do. But I was also determined to try and keep schools open if I possibly could. And, I've got to say that given the huge damage that the closures have done, and given the loss of life chances that they've caused, you've got to ask yourself now whether we could have found other ways of reducing the budget of risk from COVID. Could there, if they were 10 to 20% of the R, was there some way of doing it without school closures? Now, all the advice I was getting was absolutely not. You've got to do this, and that they, along with everything else, school closures were unavoidable, and that's certainly how it seemed to me then.
I'm sure we'll come back to that, and particularly in relation to the decision to close schools on the 4th of January. But just before we leave this issue, you'll understand that one of the points that has been put across Module 8 of this inquiry is the question of whether or not, when it came to the most important decisions about children, so principally the decisions to close schools, whether the Department for Education was sufficiently a part of those decisions. In other words, did it have a seat at the table whenever those decisions were made? Do you recognise that as a problem in the decisions that you made to close schools?
The absence of the DFE at the table?
Yes, and because the Secretary of State for Education is ostensibly the minister who represents children's interests in government.
Well, at this distance in time, I'm afraid I don't remember any sense then that the DFE was absent. I think that they would have been involved in... the papers I've seen certainly suggest that the DFE was at all the relevant discussions about the possibility of school closures.
I think we'll come and maybe look at this a bit more closely when we look at the 4th of January, but I think the general point that's being made is that when it came to the ultimate decision whether to close schools, on the two occasions that arose on the 18th of March and the 4th of January, they didn't, as it were, have a seat at the table at that point, and therefore weren't able to represent the interests of children in the way that they would if they were present.
Well, I'm so sorry, I can't comment on that because it doesn't. I don't remember that. Normally speaking, that you'd expect a cabinet decision to include everybody.
Well, I think we'll come to whether they were cabinet decisions or whether effectively they were decisions taken by you and then communicated to cabinet. But if I can, I think it goes to a broader question of whether children's interests were sufficiently well represented when you made those decisions. And whether you have any reflection on that now as to whether you think that's the case.
Well, I had a personal horror, as I've said, of closing schools. I thought it was a nightmare thing to do, and I thought it would do a lot of damage to people who would find it, to the life chances of people who would find it most difficult to bounce back and to cope. And so a lot of the focus of what I tried to do was to try and remediate that. I know you want to ask about that later, but to try to compensate for what we'd sadly had to do, because it felt to me as though children who were not particularly vulnerable to COVID, were paying a huge price to protect the rest of society, and it was an awful thing. As I said, I wish it had been otherwise. I wish we could have found another solution.
I am going to come back to that question of sacrifice and the recovery of children, but just sticking, if I may, for a moment on decision-making or on your role. One of the things that Sir Gavin Williamson has been critical of, and he gave evidence about it, was the unilateral announcement that you made on the 10th of May about reopening primary schools. And what he has said was that was a unilateral decision, that he was told that you would make the announcement that you did on the 10th of May. And if I may just remind you of it, I think that you said that after half-term, we believe that we may be in a position to bring the phased reopening of shops and to get primary school pupils back into school in stages, beginning with reception year 1 and year 6. And Sir Gavin Williamson's criticism is that effectively he had been in negotiations and discussions with schools prior to that point, and that there was a delicate, and I'm summarising his evidence, that a delicate position was reached and there was understanding on the part of schools about who would return, i.e. it would just be those few year groups, and that effectively by your actions you damaged the work that he had done with schools and you undermined trust, because in making that statement you were promising something that you knew couldn't be delivered. That's the criticism he makes of you.
Right.
Do you accept that?
Well, I'm afraid I don't remember the details of that. Though it seems to be seems a bit paradoxical to be criticised both for wanting to close schools and for wanting to get them open. I would say that it was right, given where we were, in May. We'd been through a lot. It was clear that the R was coming down. We were going to be in a position to go through the stages of the roadmap to open up the country a bit, if not entirely. And I thought it was right to go ahead with getting kids back into school. And we did it to some extent. I think there were only some classes got back in. I think it was but I think it was totally the right thing to do, given the position we were at in the pandemic, and given the detriment that kids had already suffered. I think by that stage, from my memory, it would have become a bit controversial as to whether schools were safe, and there was a certain amount of politics about this. And I think that the unions, I may be doing them a disservice, and forgive me if I am, but I think that there was a certain amount of chuntering about whether or not it was wise to get kids back into school. I thought that the evidence was that it was safe and they should go back.
I don't think Sir Gavin Williamson's criticism of you was your ambition to have all schools back. I think his criticism of you was that you undermined trust in the Department for Education, because you made that announcement unilaterally. It didn't reflect the agreement or the position he had reached with school leaders, and that you undermined confidence because you promised something that you knew at that point in time couldn't be delivered.
Right.
It couldn't be delivered.
What was that?
That because of the requirements of social distancing, this is what Gavin Williamson has said, that because of the requirements of social distancing, that what you were saying, in other words, flagging to parents and families that all children could go back, wasn't something that could be achieved, and you knew that.
Forgive me, but my memory of it is that we only got certain classes back.
Yes, but you had announced on the 10th of May, that's his criticism, that, and I put it to you, you said, we believe we may be in a position to begin the phased reopening of shops and get primary schools back into schools in stages, beginning with reception year 1 and year 6.
But that seems to me what we did.
You certainly got those years back. His criticism of you is the appearance that was given at that time that it would be possible to get all school children back, beginning with those years. Just listening
to what you've just read out, with great respect, sounds to me eerily like what we did and what Gavin had been negotiating with the teachers and the unions. So I'm not quite certain what this...
Well, it's his criticism, Mr.
Oh, right.
Johnson.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
It's his
well,
criticism
then...
that you undermined confidence, because you gave the impression and you flagged to families that children would be going back to primary school in all years when that wasn't possible.
But
that's what he's
That's not what you've just read out, though, because if I understood what you've just read out, and my memory of it is that there was going to be a staged process where we would get certain years back in advance of others. So I'm a bit at a loss as to...
I think your point is, Mr. Johnson, that you don't see that there was sufficient difference in what you announced to what Sir Gavin had been promising. Is that right?
It sounds to me that what I announced is what we did, and indeed what was common sense and what needed to be done. If it was the case that there was a negotiation going on between the DFE and the unions, which was going to preclude the possibility of kids going back, then clearly I was at variance with the DFE. But that would surprise me.
I'll move on, if I may, Mr. Johnson, to the next issue, which is that of assessment in the summer of 2020.
Yes.
Did you recognise that what happened in the summer of 2020 in terms of the assessment of children who were doing their GCSEs and A-levels was really damaging to those children in light of everything that they had already been through?
So I thought the whole business of scrapping exams was damaging, and it must have been bitterly disappointing to students who'd prepared and worked very, very hard. I didn't want to do it, and it was the logical concomitant of closing schools. So on March the 18th, it was part of the package, and we had no way around it. Certainly that's my memory of the way it went. I did think, is there some way we could keep exams alive? But we couldn't, and so we had to find a way of adjudicating on the academic achievement of the kids that didn't involve an exam. And Ofqual came up with this system. I was not expert enough to comment on it, on whether it was viable or not, but plainly it let down a lot of kids whose grades didn't reflect their abilities and their achievements. And so to answer your question, yes, I regret very much, and amongst the things I regret and I take responsibility for, is that we got the wrong initial model for how to have a substitute exam. What I would say in our defence is it wasn't easy to come up with the right model.
But you must have been concerned, Mr. Johnson, about the ministerial response to what happened after the examination results came out.
Go on.
Were you concerned, for example, that the Scottish exams came out a period of time beforehand, and that, for example, Sir Gavin Williamson hadn't used that period of time in order to, for example, develop a strategy or an understanding about what would happen when the results came out in England?
I think that my memory of this is not perfect now,
yes.
But I think it became obvious to us that the algorithm had not worked, and it was producing lots of duff results. It was letting a lot of kids down, and my advice to the department, to Gavin, was just to find I said, whatever you can do that's fair to kids, we've got to go with that. In the end, the only solution was to scrap it and go back to centrally assessed grades.
But
and I think that was, so to answer your question, I think that was the right response.
But were you not concerned about everything that happened in between that point in time? In other words, the Scottish results came out. There were a series of U-turns, weren't there, on the part of Sir Gavin Williamson before the final decision was reached, that there would be that there would be the use of centrally assessed grades, correct?
Well, I think that the decision to go back to centrally assessed grades is on August the 17th from my memory, which is not that long after the results have started to come out, I don't think. So I think there was a period, there was certainly, everybody can remember it, though, clearly it's a long time ago now, but it was a period in which a lot of young people, a lot of kids were feeling very disheartened by getting grades that they didn't feel they deserved. And it was clear from looking at the data and from looking at what their teachers had been saying about them that they were probably right. And so we had to fix it. But I'm not certain how long the interval was between us realising that and deciding to scrap it and go with the CAG.
The whole thing was a disaster, wasn't it?
I certainly think that if you mean was COVID a disaster, yes, and was the whole was the loss of education a disaster? Yes. Was the loss of exams a disaster? Yes. Was the disappointment, anger, frustration of a large number of kids, the additional frustration, a disaster? Yes, it was. But it has to be seen in the context of us trying to deal with a much, much bigger disaster. And that was the loss of learning and the loss of the exams themselves. And it was plainly not easy to come up with a substitute system.
I was asking a very specific question about assessed grades and whether you accepted that that was a particular disaster and a disaster for those young people.
Well, the centrally assessed grades would turn out to be the right way of doing it, but the algorithm plainly was a disaster. Yes.
You keep saying the algorithm, Mr. Johnson, but the algorithm, you do appreciate and understand that the algorithm was a design arrived at because it was the intention to moderate grades. Yes?
Yes.
And it was always the intention that if centre-assessed grades were judged to be too high, that they would be marked down. Yes?
I think as I understood the anxiety, it was that there would be a year, an abnormal year, in which there was such grade inflation as to devalue everybody's grades, and that was the problem. And it was so the reason I perfectly accept your point, but as I understood it, the reason for the algorithm was to try and avoid that disaster.
Yes, but the algorithm, that was the whole purpose and intent behind the algorithm. It was to mark grades down in the event that happened, correct?
I'm not here of course I'm here to defend what happened in government and every bit of it, but I don't the system that we came up with clearly failed or caused far too much disappointment and far too many people got the wrong grades. As I understand it, that arose from good intentions which were to try to protect the integrity of the examination system in a very, very difficult year and with nightmare consequences for kids' education, and to try to ensure that their qualifications would be as valuable in the future as those of any other year. That was the intention, and it failed in that intention. I perfectly accept. I think it was not done with bad intent.
I'm just going to ask, if we may, to turn to the paper that was drawn up afterwards by the Cabinet Office. This is at INQ 000137292, page 1, and we can see this is dated the 24th of August. Mr. Johnson, yes?
Yes.
And I think at paragraph 2, we can see it set out that there was an initial timeline and key documents. It said it's too early to draw firm conclusions. You will want to decide whether a lessons learned inquiry would be useful. And then it sets out some of the reasons why that would be a good thing, concluding at the end of that paragraph, plus we should properly understand what failed and would get credit for asking the question, do you want to see options? I think on that, I don't think there was a lessons learned inquiry, was there?
No, I think that the lesson that the department learned was pretty obvious, which is that the system that they came up with wasn't suitable for these types of emergencies.
I think if we go over the page, please, to paragraph 4. The document sets out some of the initial insights into what this sequence of events had demonstrated. So setting out, it's striking that none of the bigger picture questions about what the department was trying to achieve, i.e., or e.g. prioritising no grade inflation, were tested at an early stage. And there's a significant contrast here with the more generous approach taken to other impacts, for example, furlough. So I think what this paper was demonstrating or explaining was that there were bigger lessons to learn in terms of the fairness toward children. Do you agree?
I think that was obvious from what happened, and I can only assume that the department will not be, should we have another year where we can't stage exams in the way we want. I'm sure that the department will not be, and the government will not be going down this route again.
Did you understand that there was a critical issue, and it was one that had been raised by Sir John Coles, about the fairness of the approach that was being taken with this algorithm? Were you aware of that?
I don't think so. I think my memory of this is that the criticisms only really surfaced after the results started to come through. But at this distance in time, it's hard to be sure.
So you may not have known that Sir John Coles saw Sir Gavin Williamson, had a meeting with him in order to explain what he thought was unfair about the approach that was taken.
I'm so sorry. I don't remember that.
But in terms of what this paper was setting out, that it took the department a long time to accept the scale of the challenge and the impact of the pandemic and the potential problems it would cause for these students. Yes, do you accept that's what this paper is explaining?
I certainly think that the impact of the pandemic was very severe, and it was a nightmare for the departments to understand exactly how they were going to respond, and particularly when it came to exams. I think that Gavin were doing their best with a particular solution that was designed to prevent grade inflation. That was one objective that they had in mind. In so doing, unfortunately, they caused all sorts of other problems, and the approach had to be reversed.
And it sets out, doesn't it, at the third bullet, many of the issues with the algorithm were known about and could have been corrected in advance of results day.
Well,
and then going on down a bit, the reasons why they were not are likely to include the department not owning this problem enough, the relationship between the department and Ofqual as independent regulator, the failure of the centre to hold the department and Ofqual to account, and the lack of technical scrutiny of the Ofqual model.
It seems to me that the department has got abundant explanation for the problems of the model it chose.
When you, in the aftermath of all of this, and given the consequences that this whole assessment issue had for children, you did realise, didn't you, and you did think that this raised question marks about the whole leadership of the Department for Education, didn't? That is right, isn't it?
I certainly thought that the public outcry, the level of disappointment, pain on the part of individual candidates was awful, and it's fair to say that yes, of course, I thought about whether there was a need to respond to that by changing people's jobs and so on and so forth, of course.
It was really undermining of public confidence, this issue, wasn't it?
I think that I can't comment on that. I don't have any evidence for that. I think that it certainly was very undermining for the confidence of kids who thought they deserved a better grade, and it was a bad system. I'm afraid that it was an accident of the great difficulties we faced in improvising in exceptionally difficult circumstances. And I think most people actually, and with great respect to what you say, I think most people, although they wanted it corrected and they wanted their individual students' interests looked after, I think most people could also see that.
Mr. Johnson, I'm not going to go back to the point about whether this was an accident or not, but if we just go to your messages about
well, so we wouldn't have set out to to scrap exams and have people's grades decided by this system.
No, but there was thought that could be given to what sort of algorithm you wanted, and the balance between trying to control grades and doing fairness to individual students. Do you accept that?
Yes, I imagine that there must have been such thought. I do, but I wasn't privy to it at the time.
But just turning to the leadership of the Department for Education, and I think we have this in your messages at INQ 00028 3369, page 37, and it's just at the top of that page. And it's only the message at the top of the page that matters. And it begins, we need a plan for the Department of Education, we need a Perm Sec, and we need better ministers. And quite frankly, we need an agenda of reform. We can't go on like this. I'm thinking of going into number 10 and firing people. Mr. Johnson, that reveals the truth, doesn't it, of what you thought about how the leadership of the Department for Education was during the pandemic.
It certainly reveals that I was at that particular moment when I fired off that particular intemperate message, I was in a very bad mood about what had happened. Yeah, that'd be fair.
And without going into the details of it, the permanent secretary did leave, correct?
That's correct.
But you didn't ask Sir Gavin Williamson to leave, did you?
Not then, no.
Ought you to have done?
Well, I think if I look back at the general handling of my beloved colleagues over the 3 years or 3 and a bit years I was in government, I can think of all sorts of changes I might have made, but. I don't think there's any point in speculating about it now. Except, I think that on the whole, given the difficulties that we faced, I think that the department under Gavin did a pretty heroic job in trying to cope with COVID, and that was my judgment.
After this happened, did you speak to young people or address them directly in order to express any regret about what had happened?
I'm so sorry. I'm sure I was interviewed about the matter repeatedly, but I cannot now remember what I said. But I'm sure I would have expressed the regret and contrition that I feel now. I mean, it was not a good system. We should not have put it through. We should have spotted it faster. I mean, I think that your criticisms are valid, all I would say is that, you know, you try coming up with a system to give a fair exam result for people when they can't sit exams. It's not easy, okay? That's all I would say.
It's really the broader question, Mr. Johnson, and the point has been made by other witnesses in Module 8 that you didn't, for example, have press conferences where you took questions from children or spoke to children. And I think the point has been made that
that's a good point.
In distinction to other political leaders who did make that effort to speak directly to children, that you didn't.
Well, that's if that's the case, then that's a criticism that I must accept. I mean, I remember doing lots of press conferences with young people, but I think that was before COVID. Yeah, I've got to put my hands up. Maybe we should have done that.
Is there a reason why not to, though, Mr. Johnson?
I honestly, if I had to, I think we were trying to deal with a very difficult pandemic that was very dangerous for a lot of people in our country, and maybe I should have done as you suggest. I'm fairly certain that I spoke generally to everybody about my regret for what had happened. But no, I don't think I did a particular press conference for young people about it. That might have been a good thing to do.
At around this period of time, and when I say that, I mean the period leading up to school closure, to schools being reopened.
Yes.
So we're in and around the August of 2020. I don't think I need to bring you to this. It was a document that was put before Sir Gavin Williamson, but it seems that there was a deliberate tactical decision not to inform schools of the existence of a fallback plan when they were reopening. I can show you the document.
Yes, I know. I think I know what you're referring to. Yes.
I don't want to mislead you, but I think that the point is made about that would be made about that is that it was really unfair to schools to keep them in the dark about having a fallback plan at the time that you were asking them to reopen. I don't know. I think I can remember the document you're talking about. I don't think the intention was to keep them in the dark if it had genuinely seemed that we weren't going to be able to proceed with the roadmap and that they would have to reopen. And clearly, as soon as that had become obvious, we would have enlisted the whole sector, gone public, and got people going. I think that if you remember when the schools closed, there was a lot of fraying around the edges before the actual decision, and we've discussed already the difficulties of the period from May when we do the June the 1st partial reopenings. There was a lot of politics in all this. And my anxiety was just, I think, as far as we could, to keep it simple. And, until such time as we were going to have to change tack, we should keep on the course we were on. My lady, is that an appropriate moment?
Certainly, Mr. Johnson, remember we take regular breaks. By the sounds of it, you take some water as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I shall return at 11:30. I promise you we will complete your evidence by lunchtime.
Thank you. Thank you.
All rise.
Thank you.
Dobbin.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Johnson, may I turn then to a completely different subject, which is that of the closure of schools as announced on the 4th of January 2021. You must have been really keen to ensure that the calamitous closure of schools as occurred in March 2020 wasn't repeated again. Would that be right?
Absolutely. It was the last thing I wanted to do, of course.
And Miss Susan Ackland Hood has given evidence that over the course of December, two things happened. First of all, that there was an increasing ask on the Department for Education in terms of the amount of testing that it would have to ensure was provided. Do you recollect that?
Yes, absolutely. And that was very much in the context of the period at the second half of 2020, when we started to get very interested in mass testing as a way of reopening settings, schools and other things. And it's absolutely correct that I wanted to see mass testing in schools as part of the way of getting schools open.
And I think what she gave evidence of was a very specific set of increases in the ask that was being made of the Department for Education, which in turn became the ask being made of schools. Do you recollect that?
I do, and I remember that it wasn't easy, and I think that the department, again, I think the department acquitted themselves heroically in this respect. I think they really tried to get mass testing going. I think they stood up a huge amount of facilities very, very fast. But as I'm sure you're coming to, that it was just never going to be a runner because of the Alpha, the Kent variant.
I'll turn to that. The other point that she made and developed in her evidence was that in terms of the manpower to provide the testing, that it became clear that that would also have to be provided, as it were, largely by the Department for Education, but in reality it would have to be provided by schools. Again, does that accord with your memory?
It does, and I was conscious of the extra burden we were putting on teachers, and it's as you know, the way the schools work in this country, what the man and woman in Whitehall says doesn't necessarily follow everywhere, and it's a very complicated system. But on the whole, the schools did stand up a quite extraordinary amount of testing capability.
So, Mr. Johnson, we've heard the Department for Education perspective on the events leading up to the 4th of January, and we've heard the perspective of Professor Sir Chris Whitty as well. I think it's important that the inquiry also hears your evidence about your perspective on it. But can I take you, and just to set the scene, to a document that we have at INQ 0009 1147. This wasn't a document addressed to you, Mr. Johnson, because it was the chair's brief for this COVID-0 meeting of the 16th of December 2020. But we can see underneath the introduction that you had given a strong steer that you would like the return to face-to-face attendance to be staggered and for testing to be used as fully as possible to support this. Yes?
Yes.
And if we look at the last bullet in that sequence, that we are all well aware that this is a major delivery challenge, correct?
Yes.
And I think if we go over the page, please, to the background, and if we look at the second bullet, it records that the Education Secretary had spoken to you that morning, that there had been agreement about who would go back and the testing in place. And then beneath that there were significant delivery challenges, correct?
Yes.
And it says at the bottom of that paragraph, the biggest issue to resolve is workforce. There is not yet agreement as to where this will come from. Teaching, military, other surge workforce, etc. And therefore the Department of Health and Social Care Secretary of State didn't want to put his name to the paper, correct? Do you remember that? That there was...
I remember the difficulties in standing up the testing operation. I remember the department really straining to get it done. But what I also remember is that in the end, that I think they were in a position to deliver. I remember. Though I can't remember the ins and outs of it, I remember a conversation about the MACA and whether we'd use the army or not. But I think it ended up with the schools doing it.
And do you recollect the tensions at this time between the Secretary of State for Health and the Secretary of State for Education in terms of trying to resolve where this manpower would come from?
I'm sorry, I don't remember the specifics of that.
All right, and I think if we go to the position that was reached then on the 28th of December, and we have this at INQ 000075504. And again, Mr. Johnson, just to help with your memory of this, we can see that this is an email of the 28th of December.
28th, right.
Yes. Yeah. From a Miss Burns from number 10. And obviously by this stage it's very clear, isn't it, that the new variant was what was driving transmission, correct?
Yes,
that's
right. I mean, the documents I've just looked at to refresh my memory suggested that really the penny sort of started to drop on the 22nd, but yes, I think it was very clear by the 28th.
All right. And if we look at the second paragraph below those first set of bullets, that the Education Secretary had set out the social cost of closing schools. And then below that we see again the 4 bullets for getting schools back, yes?
Yes.
And we can see here the plan set out that in terms of secondary schools that there would be a delay until the 18th of January to get all of the children back.
Yes.
And then that there would be the weekly testing of of pupils, yes?
Yes. Is this the 28th still?
It is, yes. And I think if we go over the page, please. This is quite a long section, Mr. Johnson, and I won't read all of it out. But I think we can see here some of the different arguments being ventilated. So the first part of that page, we can see set out the Secretary of State for Health's arguments. Yes?
Yes.
So that it would be that the 18th of January might be too soon, and seeking a clear decision at this point. Yes?
Yes.
And is that right? Was he effectively arguing that a decision ought to be made as or around that date as to whether or not schools should in fact reopen in the January?
Look, I think you can generally take it during this period that there's... I can't remember the specifics about the issue on testing between DFE and Department of Health, but there's generally a tension about, whether it's going to be sensible to open up and how fast, or as soon as we see the Kent variant, the Alpha variant, and I don't remember Matt saying that, but it seems entirely plausible.
Okay, and if we just read this down, and if we drop down a couple of paragraphs, we can see reference to the advice that was being given by the Chief Scientific Advisor. And if we follow that down by a couple of sentences, he was advising, we know that children do transmit and take it back into households, and that when half-term occurs, there is a decrease in spread, so advising that school closures do have an effect, correct?
Yes. So why are we talking about half-term now? Because we got Christmas.
I think he's talking about retrospectively. It can be seen that half-term has an effect.
Yes, right.
And then after that, we can also see the advice being provided by the Chief Medical Officer as well, who was also advising that it was regional differences at this point in time that was making the decision difficult, correct?
That looks the kind of, yes, I mean, I'm sure that's right.
But may I just focus then on the last paragraph of this section? In conclusion, the Prime Minister understood the DFE proposal and thought that mass testing proposal sounded positive, although overall he could also see the arguments for having a lower risk appetite on opening. Decisions would need to be taken in the round this week. And then we can see set out in the meantime on schools specifically, he would like to urgently see the delivery plan on testing in every school for the start of term, as well as understanding the precise policy, i.e. are we compelling individual schools, how, what's the form of words he could use, and whether weekly testing is deliverable, and what could be done to make that happen. And then we can see, please can the DFE provide a note on the above, working with test and trace for 6:30 p.m. And I think we can see that that email was sent by 3:30, was sent at 3:30 p.m. So again, does that correspond with your memory, Mr. Johnson, that even as at this date,
what date is this now?
28th of December, that there wasn't a clear plan as far as you were concerned for testing in schools, and that you were still seeking clarification as to what such a plan would look like?
Yes, I think I was seeking clarification, but I don't think that that meant that I thought that it was undeliverable. I mean, my impression was that they were making progress and that they were going to be able to stand up testing. And I maybe I'm wrong. I think that was the testimony of Mrs. Ackland Hood as well, but I might be wrong about that.
Well, I'm just testing at the moment what your understanding was on the 28th of December, because some of the questions that seem to be asked by you at this point seem like quite fundamental questions.
Sure, and quite rightly, but I don't. All I'm trying to say is, from the best of my memory, that doesn't mean that I thought that the plan was necessarily undeliverable. You know, I wanted to make sure that we belt and braced it, that it was all ready to go, but I wasn't going to junk it.
And can you help with why at this point? I mean, it very much appears to be the case, and borne out by what Miss Ackland Hood explained, that this massive effort was very much on the shoulders of the Department for Education and schools, as opposed to being a more shared effort. Why was it? Why had it fallen principally to the department and to schools to deliver this massive?
Well, they had to test.
They
had to test secondary school kids going back into secondary school, which was going to be, you know, I think we had a plan to stagger that anyway. I didn't think it was such an unreasonable thing to ask. I know it was onerous, but I believe they could do it given the alternative. And the alternative was again more loss of learning, greater detriment to their pupils, about which they cared passionately, and as did we all.
Yes, but Miss Ackland's had evidence about that was that she felt they were asking something deeply unreasonable of schools. You know, in other words, the teachers were there to teach the children. They weren't there to implement a mass testing regime in secondary schools, although her evidence is that nonetheless schools rose to the challenge.
I think they did.
And I think, again, it's coming back to the point, Mr. Johnson, about the importance that was attached to this or not by government in terms of getting children back to school.
Well, I think huge importance was attached to it, and that's why we kept going with the policy in spite of the obvious difficulties. And if you look at we were in an environment where the numbers of cases were starting to rise quite sharply, and I also knew, of course, that we were going to have the vaccines coming down the track at some point. It seemed to me that this was, I knew it was a huge effort, but it was worth it just to get the kids back in school. And if we could use my plan was to try to use mass testing as I told the inquiry before, as a way to try to reopen society. And in the end, that didn't work, and it was superseded by the vaccines. But in the second half of 2020, that was the only shot we had. Mass testing was the only way through for the country that I could see, and so that was why it was so important. Now, should DHSC have done it? Should the army have done it? Should some other body have done it to relieve the pressure on teachers and schools? Very possibly. I can't, I'm afraid, now go into the arguments, because I simply can't at this stage recollect them. I can imagine that health and social care staff were very heavily engaged doing other things, as were the others. But I can't give you the balance of the arguments now. We had to, if we could stand up testing in schools, we had to do it if we possibly could, and that was the plan. We were beaten by Alpha.
And may I ask you, were you satisfied ultimately that the plans for schools, despite the enormous ask of teachers, were you satisfied that they were sufficiently robust? That they
the plans for testing?
Yes, that they did have a chance. I mean, obviously that changed, but in terms of the plans that you had asked for and the increased ask, were you satisfied that the Department for Education was in the position of being able to deliver that?
My memory is I had confidence in them and in what they were doing. It's clear from those questions that I'm pushing them so that I'm going to be in a position to get, because the public will be extremely interested and concerned to hear about their kids being tested in school. They're going to want to know who's in charge, how it works, and all sorts of things. I need to know the details. So I think that's why I'm asking those questions. I'm going to have to explain it.
Yes, but you're asking the really basic question of can we actually do weekly testing in schools?
Yes, and I think I think the answer was yes, but it was tough. But many of the things that we faced in COVID were extremely tough.
And was the position reached then once again that you were effectively overtaken by events? Because on the 30th of December, in fact, you had to start closing primary schools in different parts of England.
It was an absolute. It was. I mean, of all the really, really low moments it was terrible, that whole period, because I could see the cavalry coming over the hill in the form of the vaccines. I thought mass testing offered a way forward, but it was clear that the January spike, I think, was bigger than the April spike of 2020, and I mean, that plan to open on January the 4th, staggered, was defeated by Alpha.
Was it the worst of all worlds then that some primary schools around the country opened on the 4th of January only to have to close again that day because of the reversal of position? Yes,
but it was, and I'm very sorry to them for their efforts that were in vain. But the inquiry was asking, I'm sure you are, about were there other options we could have used then at any stage to reduce the R other than closing schools? Was that really the right tool to use? Looking back, honestly, I'm not certain, but at the time, it seemed like the only option. If the risk was, if we had another doubling, we would see a very serious number of fatalities, and then another doubling. And we had to get the R below 1. I think that's what people sometimes forget, why something, a relatively small thing like closing schools can take the speed out of the circulation and make all the difference. 'Cause otherwise, sorry.
No, sorry, I was interrupting you. Sorry.
Well, no, but otherwise, mathematically, it either doubles or halves.
That I certainly follow. Mr. Johnson, can I ask, why was it that the decision had to wait, so that to close had to wait? In other words, they opened, the primary schools opened 4th of January and then closed that night. Could the decision not have been taken earlier, that you were forced to close?
I'm sure, look, with hindsight, my lady, of course it could have been taken earlier, and it would have looked better and have felt less bumpy to everybody had it been taken earlier. Of course, that's right. But at the time, it wasn't as obvious to me as it seems now. At the time, I was still very much divided and very, very keen, as indeed was Gavin Williamson, to see if we could keep going.
Just turning to Sir Gavin Williamson, what he sets out in his witness statement, and perhaps we can just bring this up for ease. It's at INQ 000 588 024, please. Page 83 and paragraph 10.26. Just to highlight, Mr. Johnson, I think the point about how 11th hour this decision actually was. His evidence is that when he spoke to you on the morning of the 4th of January 2021, your message to him was about keeping schools open and doing everything to ensure that that remained the position, and that he explained that something like 85% of schools had actually opened. So in other words, saying...
looking at that, I can understand how a Secretary of State would feel frustrated. Of course, I totally understand that, and it was a very, very difficult situation, and we had to take decisions throughout the pandemic based on our best judgment of the way things were at the time, and that inevitably changed, and that was the day, sadly, when it became clear to me that we couldn't continue with a policy of opening the schools. Now, maybe it should have occurred to me, maybe I should have resolved that earlier in my mind, but that's easy to say with hindsight. I wanted, if I possibly could, to keep them open.
If we just look, please, at what he says just after that, please, at paragraph 10.27, he says that he receives a phone call from Mr. Rosenfield at 12:30 that day to tell him that, in fact, schools would close. So I think, Mr. Johnson, to come full circle on the point that was made at the very start of your evidence, and this question of whether or not the Department for Education was at the table when some of these most significant decisions were made, I think we see here that they weren't at the table and that you told him that schools would close. That is right, isn't it?
Yes, and that's absolutely right. And I think you're looking at the reality of the way things have to run in government, and particularly during a pandemic. Gavin rightly owned the interests of schools and young people. He had to promote that. I had the problem of trying to balance the interests of the entire country and every single potential COVID victim. And it was hellishly difficult. And of course, I think Gavin has said, I think my instincts were, my inclinations were very much the same as his, but in the end, we had to take the public health issue into account, and we had to put it first. I'm sorry, but we had to put it first.
So if we just, in terms of going to the meeting where the decision was made, then we have that at INQ 000146739, please. And I think that we can see from the top of this that it's the 4th of January and it's the COVID-0 meeting. Is that right?
It sounds right, yes.
And
yes.
we can see that those present are Sir Michael Gove, the Chancellor, and the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, correct?
Yes.
And various officials. And I
Yes.
think that if we go over the page then, please, to page 4. And I think it's the penultimate paragraph, Mr. Johnson. We can see here the Director General for Strategy in the Covid-19 Task Force said that there were big choices for the Committee on Schools. Yes, so returning to the question of whether schools should reopen after the 18th of January, yes? That's secondary schools, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And I think as well, if we look in terms of the things that were discussed during that meeting, if we look at B, for example, so in discussion, sorry, it's page 5. It sets out all of the things that were discussed. And for example, we see at B, it was always better to surprise on the upside rather than the downside. Therefore, government should act quickly and robustly to close all schools. Further on down, there was mass flagrant abuse of the rules, and unless measures taken were even tougher than in March, they would not be taken seriously. Yes?
Yes, I don't remember that particular intervention, but that does not surprise me at all.
And then a few paragraphs down from this paragraph E, any intervention would only be successful if it succeeded in changing public behaviour, yes?
Yes.
And then the reference there underneath it, G, that deaths had increased by 25% within a week, yes? So
Yeah.
the stark public health issue that you had to confront, correct?
Correct.
And then if we go over the page, please, to H, the suggestion that schools could resume face-to-face learning for all students at the end of January, from the February half term, or from the end of February, yes.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And I don't think we need to go through the whole of this document, but it is right, isn't it, that at the end of this meeting you then decided that you would close schools to all children once again, correct?
Yes. Yes. I think that's right. This is the 4th of.
Yes, it
yes,
is.
absolutely. Yes.
And it obviously fits in with what Sir Gavin Williamson has said, that he spoke to you first thing in the morning when it was, your message was, yes, schools are staying open, full steam ahead, so to speak, only for him to be told a couple of hours later that that was no longer the case, yes?
That's correct.
And that this was the meeting that happened in between to change the direction of travel, yes?
There I'm not certain, but it looks,
fits
there
with
would be plenty of discussions going on throughout the day and people bringing me bits of information, but that could well be how it happened. Yes, I just can't remember.
But I think, Mr. Johnson, from everything you've said, you didn't see any issue about taking this decision on the 4th of January without having the Department for Education at the table to speak to any of these issues about education or when schools might be able to reopen or any of the other issues that were relevant.
If you look at so I'd spent the day in contact with Gavin, I think by our own account of this thing. This day, I'm talking to him in the morning. I'm well aware of his position. I'm well aware of his concerns, and we've been talking about it the whole time, continuously. And as I said, I shared his instincts and understood very much what his message was. There was no need for I didn't need to to hear him directly in my ear to understand what he would feel about this. But it was clear to me that because of Alpha, the balance of the argument had shifted, and I could have. I had no option. I had no option given the facts as they presented themselves that day. I felt I had no option but to close down and or to prevent the reopening of schools. Imagine the kind of factual. Imagine, well, you know, there's no need for me to go through it.
Mr. Johnson, Sir Gavin Williamson has been very critical of the decisions to close schools on the 4th of January.
And I understand why he feels as he does. And he's, you know, people are. He was the Secretary of State for Education. He wanted to see kids in school, and that's entirely laudable.
I mean, what he has said is that the decision was made, and I'm paraphrasing, but I hope accurately, that the decision was made not because it would have a significant impact on the infection rate, but more because the government had to be seen to be using all possible options to turn things around.
Well, again, I respectfully disagree, because although the schools themselves might make up a small part of the budget of measures that you need to press the R, it can be critical. And the problem with bringing the schools back, as everybody knows, is that there's a delay because of when the virus starts circulating in schools. There's a delay between the kids contracting it and then passing it on, and then the adults being infected, and so you're storing up potentially very, very big problems. And I think I understand his frustration, and it's a proper frustration on the part of a Secretary of State with a department to run who's thinking about kids and their interests.
He said that it had, and I mean the closure of schools in January 2021 was likened to smashing a Ming vase on the floor. So in other words, that you had to do something, you had to make a bold move and something dramatic in order to get the public.
We had to stop a second doubling of a doubling of the wave. I think the paper we've just been looking at said there'd been a 25% increase in deaths overnight. I think I may have got that wrong. You can't ignore that sort of data.
And again, I'm putting the criticisms, Mr. Johnson, he makes, but he said that it was a panic decision and that it wasn't required.
Well, you know, I respectfully disagree. It grieved everybody to have to do it. It's the last thing I wanted to do. But the numbers were very difficult to argue with.
Can I ask, as far as you were concerned, in January 21, was there a direct causative link between closing schools and reducing the R number? Or was it the effect of closing schools on the public messaging, which seemed to be what one of the papers...
The Ming vase point?
Yeah.
No, I think it was... well, I mean, obviously it was...
Was it both?
It was both. But as I understood it, the schools alone could take about 10 or 20% out of the R. So if the R is 1.1, that obviously gets you halving rather than doubling, and that's a critical thing.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, I think from everything you have said, that you accept that these periods of school closure had the most awful impact on all children in England of school age, and also more a disproportionate impact on those most disadvantaged children in our society. And it was for that reason, wasn't it, that you appointed Sir Kevin Collins as Educational Recovery Commissioner, is that right?
Yeah.
Just before we go on to his to your evidence about his appointment and his recovery plan, I just wanted to refer to an account that was given to the inquiry in its Every Story Matters piece of work. And this was selected because, on the one hand, it's probably a story that isn't that out of the ordinary for many young people, but
I read it. It's about the footballer.
Yes. I'm just going to, maybe if we bring that up on screen, please. But the parent who set out, my eldest son was expected to get scouted at 16 by a football club, but lockdown started shortly after his 16th birthday. After many months without intense training, his fitness and skills dropped, and he feels he was robbed of the chance to make it. This caused him to become depressed. Along with having missed his school leaving, GCSEs being ruined, not seeing his girlfriend, and all his social life being put to an end, his depression levels started to rise. One evening in July 2020, I got a call from his friend's mum saying he was threatening to attempt suicide and had gone out at 2 a.m. to a wood. Thankfully, he had told his friend, who went out to find him, and we quickly sought mental health support privately. So there are probably many stories like that across England, but extraordinary for the family who finds themselves in that situation, yes.
Terrible, yes.
And the impacts, obviously, there were educational impacts, but the impacts went far, far beyond that, didn't they?
They did, and it was one of the reasons, whether the main reason, why I was so deeply reluctant to go with school closures throughout the time, because after the first lockdown, I went to see a school in. I saw several, but I remember going to one in Kent and talking to the kids. It was obvious that some had been fine, and some had been very far from fine. And I'd say the most had been fine, but a significant number of kids were very badly affected by this thing, and it was very difficult to remediate. And we did our best as I've said out in my statement.
Do you think the consequences have proved to be worse than you anticipated?
That's a good question. I think that they were certainly as bad as they were certainly on the worst end of my expectations. Some of the things that happened, yeah.
So the appointment of Sir Kevin Collins was a chance, wasn't it, to help children recover and to compensate for the sacrifice that they had made, which was largely for the benefit of everyone else in society. Do you agree? Right. And Sir Kevin Collins, and we can bring this up quickly, I think, it's at INQ 000542716, page 1, please. This is a very neat visual representation of what he was suggesting by way of his recovery plan. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
And the one thing that I think he placed a real premium on, and we'll come to this in terms of its cost, was adding to the time that children would have in school. Thank you, that can come down. And one of the reasons he was keen that children have time in school was because it would afford the opportunity for other enrichment activities, correct?
Absolutely.
It wasn't just getting kids back to school so that they can do maths. It was about all of the other activities that help children's development. And I think we see in Sir Kevin Collins' statement, and again, if we could bring this up briefly, please, INQ 000649897. And I think we can take it, please, from page 8. Thank you. Paragraph 3.13 and 3.14. He sets out in the course of this statement, Mr. Johnson, and I know you've seen it, about the contact he kept with you in order to be able to keep you updated with the plans that he had, correct?
That's right.
And do you accept that one of the reasons he did that was because effectively he wanted to keep you on board with them?
Yes.
And thank you, that can come down. And he sets that out. Sorry, if we could keep the statement up. He sets out from paragraph 3.23 onwards about the updating that he provided to you. It's 3.23. So he sets out here, I won't read through all of this, Mr. Johnson, but that he had sent you a note on the 26th of February, and where he had sets out here the amount of loss that school closures had produced, the economic loss. And if we could just carry on, please. At 3.24, he explains that he set out the pillars of his plan. Thank you. At 3.25, I think an endorsing note from you that you were pleased with his direction of travel. And then at 3.26 and 3.27, he explains that he also made clear the costs of his plans as well, correct?
Yes.
And I think importantly, for our purposes, he sets that out at 3.27. So in other words, on the 5th of March,
Yes.
he had provided the costings. And he explains, and again, we can take this from 3.39, please. That he sent you a note on the 14th of May setting out the overall cost of his plans, correct?
Yes.
So the maximal cost and the least cost, and I think he sets out at 3.40 that would have come as no surprise to you.
Yes.
Because he had set that out a number of months before, correct?
Yes.
And it's right, Mr. Johnson, isn't it, that after this point, the plans were steadily whittled down?
Yes. And not surprisingly, because 15.9 billion is a lot of money, but yes.
Yes, well, I think the question is, why didn't you say that in the March of 2021 when he was developing those plans?
Well, because I wanted to test his proposals, and I wanted to see the evidential basis for what he was arguing for. And you've made a point about timing and time in schools. And it's absolutely true that on the whole, the more time kids can spend in schools, the better it's going to be for them. And they'll, as you say, they will have opportunities to do things that will be of value. However, I think the overall cost of the time component of his proposals was the thick end of it. I mean, it was like 2/3, if not more, was the time. I may be wrong about that, but my memory was a huge amount went on that proposal alone. And when I dug into it, the evidence for the remedial benefits for individual kids who'd suffered detriment to their learning was not very strong. And that was the point that was put to me both by the department and by my officials.
The department, sorry, forgive me.
So I had to make a difficult choice. It's not the first time. We just spent 480 billion already on COVID. The country, even now, is struggling with a huge debt burden, which is putting up the cost of interest rates for everybody in this country. Just to throw another 10 billion on something for which the evidential basis is not very strong is not something that you should normally be doing. There was a policy in Kevin's plan, and I'm grateful to him. And I think he did it. And you know, he was doing the right thing by his profession and by his beliefs in trying to get the maximum money out of government, out of me. What he did was entirely reasonable. But my job was to try and sort out what was really practical and sensible from what was going to be very difficult in a very tough fiscal environment. And so I thought that the direct targeted teaching to try to help individuals who had fallen behind sounded like a much better use of public money. And that was what we went for. And we spent very considerable sums on that. And I think it was the right thing to do on the whole, the tutoring programme. I still think it's the right thing to do.
I mean, what he was setting out to you over the course of months was his rationale as to why he put a premium on time and why he thought it was so important that children had that extra time in school, including so that they could do enrichment activities.
Yeah, I understand.
In other words, the longer
I understand
day.
that completely, but it just didn't cohere with other advice I was being given about the benefits of the three offers.
If we just look at his resignation letter, which is at INQ 000 542974. Because it's right, isn't it, Mr. Johnson, that when he saw how much the plans had been whittled down and the amount of proposed spending, that he felt his position was untenable, correct?
Well, to be fair to Kevin, he'd done his job. You might say his position was untenable, but he was functus officio, as they say. He'd done it. You know, he produced his report, and it was very, very good. But clearly, he was aiming very high.
Well, he wasn't functus because he resigned, correct? And you had wanted him to stay on, hadn't you, and to endorse the plans? That
would have been great. But that would have been great. Yeah. So look, I mean, of course, I regret his resignation. But I mean, he'd done what I needed to do. He'd done a great deal of work, and I'm very grateful to him because he had looked genuinely and hard at how you could help kids who'd suffered from COVID. Now, I had to put that through our Mensa and work out what was really valuable and where we would end up. And the advice I was being given was that the policy with the greatest benefits was the targeted teaching.
Just looking at his resignation letter, and again, I won't read all of this out. He sets out at the third paragraph about your ambition to recover the lost learning, and sets out that he then, I think, regarded that as his responsibility to try and deliver it. That he set out in the paragraph, we see this in the paragraph below, I told you I do not believe it will be possible to deliver a successful recovery without significantly greater support than the government has to date indicated it intends to provide, and setting out his fear that it was a false economy. And then that paragraph below, I believe our approach to recovery should also offer children opportunities to re-engage with sport, music and the rich range of activities that define a great education. I proposed extending school time as a way to provide this breadth, as well as to ensure that additional academic support does not cause existing enrichment activities to be squeezed out. And then goes on to set out at the end, I suppose, the rationale for his resignation. I do not believe it's credible that a successful recovery can be achieved with a programme of support of this size.
Well, I really am grateful to Kevin for what he did, and I respect his opinion. And look, in an ideal world, clearly we would all like to see all our children better provided for all the things that he he mentions. There are huge sums that we could and probably should spend. The difficulty is that we have certainly post-COVID, a very constrained fiscal position, and we have to, the government today has to be mindful of the bond markets. Why is Rachel Reeves continually talking about putting taxes up? It's because if she doesn't, the international finance will mark Britain down, and if she's seen to spend too much, they'll mark Britain down. I would love to of course, to do much more to support kids across the country, but I had to look at what was genuinely going to provide value for money, and I looked at it very hard and agreed that we could spend several billion, which we did, on tutoring, and I think help about 3 million kids, 3 million pupils, with a huge number of interventions, and really make a big difference. And actually, I think that direct tutoring, one-on-one coaching, inspiring kids in that way, can be massively, massively beneficial. And I think that it's the tutoring generally has been for too long the preserve of the ambitious parents or people with the resources to do it. And I wanted to level up. I wanted to give other kids that opportunity. And Kevin was very helpful in setting out how we could do that.
And do you accept that the package fell below what was required to really help children recover?
I see why he's saying that. I don't necessarily accept that. I think that circumstances were very difficult. We had to maximise taxpayer value and deliver the best we could for kids.
Do you accept that you led Sir Kevin Collins on?
Yes.
Over a period of months?
Yes, I did. Because I wanted him to produce his wish list. I liked him. I liked him. I thought, I saw eye to eye with him on what he wanted to do in many ways, and so I wanted to hear from him what, in an ideal world, he would do, and that's what he produced. And in my view, it was simply the parts that he mentions in that letter were too expensive and didn't have the same impact as some of the other proposals.
I think what you said in a message to Miss Misra, who worked within Downing Street.
Yeah, Mirza, yeah.
Mirza, forgive me. You said to her in a message, I don't think I need to go to it. I did encourage him and allowed myself to be carried away, and he thought he was on to a big winner, correct?
That sounds like a pretty fair summary, yes.
So, I mean, for all the protestations about regret and the cost borne by children, you seem to shrug off this episode as though it were almost...
No, on the contrary, I think that... Again, you've got an educationalist and a passionate educationalist whose life is dedicated to trying to secure more funding from government for what he rightly thinks are the most important objectives in life, and who's put a big project on my table with a big number attached to it. But I'm in a different position. I share his desire. But I'm limited by the position we're in, and also by the need to be mindful of taxpayer value, and frankly, to get for kids the best outcome. Because I think that, and maybe I'm wrong, but my impression was, talking to a lot of people, that the targeted teaching thing was a more effective way of helping than the timing.
Mr. Johnson, I'm going to move on. Your statement, and this is the final question I want to ask you, your statement reflects, I think, your concern or the anxiety that you have about the closures of school to most children. And you say that one of my biggest anxieties now is that I'm not sure how many lives non-pharmaceutical interventions end up saving. But reflecting on everything and in terms of the evidence that you've given today, it does seem clear that you thought that it was right to close schools to most children in March 2020 and in January 2021 because it would save lives. Is that right?
I did, and I still do. Though I think what I would now say is, and I know the inquiry will want to think about future people who find themselves in the position I was in. Given the detriments, given the suffering, given the damage, was there another way of reducing the budget of risk? Was there another thing we could have done? Was there another shot we could have played? And I don't know the answer to that. Nor can I really be certain what would have happened if we'd gone with what Gavin and the DFE wanted on January the 4th, 2021, and kept going. What would really have happened? I can't know. None of us can know. But the predictions were really grim.
My lady, those are my questions. Great.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Owen. Ms. Hannett. Ms. Hannett's just there, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, I appear on behalf of Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland. In the summer of 2021, at the point of preparing for the lifting of restrictions, you were advised about paediatric long COVID. You were advised several times that the rates of long COVID in children would rise. I'm going to show you one example of that advice. It's a document dated the 7th of July, prepared by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. If you could have that up on the screen, please. It's INQ 000607384. It's a document entitled Planning for Periods of High Prevalence. If we could go to page 3, please. Paragraph 6, Roman 1, letter D, long COVID in children. You'll see it says, children represent a large unvaccinated population. We can expect cases to rise rapidly in the group. By this point, so summer 2021, it's right that the government should have provided parents with the information it held about the accepted risk of paediatric long COVID. Instead, there was no formal announcement or advice by government given about this risk, either then or indeed at all.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to repeat my sympathies for the sufferers of long COVID, which, as everybody knows, it took me personally as Prime Minister some time to establish, and the facts about long COVID it took a while to be produced for me. And if you look, if we had this before, my lady, with the requests I made for a paper on it. As for long COVID in children, I honestly don't remember being advised about the impacts of long COVID of COVID-19 in children, and I just wonder whether this sentence, the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on children, are largely known, but several reports point to the existence of long COVID in children. I'm confused by that sentence. I have to.
Can I put it this way, Mr.
Admit,
Johnson?
and I wonder whether it contains a mistake, because
Mr. Johnson, you'll forgive me. I've got limited time. Can I just follow up in this way? It's right that the inquiry has before it a number of pieces of advice from summer of 2021 that set out the risk of long COVID to children. The government never communicated that risk to parents in summer of 2021. Do you accept that it ought to have done so?
Well, certainly, if we had advice about the particular risks of long COVID in children, then we should have done so. All I can say is that this. I'm not quite clear what this particular sentence is saying, but I suspect that it contains a mistake, and that the word children there should be adults. But if you read
Johnson,
it,
we have to take it as it says. It says long COVID in children, doesn't it? That's the starting point of the paragraph. I think we have to accept that the person who wrote it wrote to children.
It's not quite clear what it's trying to say in that case, but yes.
My lady, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hannett. Mr Broach. Mr Broach is over there, Mr Johnson.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Johnson, I have questions for you on behalf of the children's rights organisations. There's no doubt the government was under immense pressure in the early stages of the pandemic. But as time went on, there was space to reflect and make more considered decisions. Scotland and Wales, for example, considered the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions on children and made decisions to exempt them from restrictions on social gatherings. In England, calls to do the same, for example, in relation to the rule of six, came from our organisations, the Children's Commissioner, and was supported by SAGE. And yet, despite there being no scientific evidence for the precise rules, of six, for example, children were not exempted. And we would say this is just one example of a sustained pattern of applying the same restrictions to children in England as to adults. Would you accept the reality was the government didn't consider children as rights holders in their own right and was seeing them merely through the lens of virus transmission and prioritising enforcement of the rules?
I think that you're making a fair point about the rules generally. I think that looking back on it all, the whole lockdowns, the intricacy of the rules, the rule of six, the complexity, particularly for children, I think we probably did go too far, and it was far too elaborate. Maybe we could have found a way of exempting children. It's a very fair point.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. In his evidence yesterday, Professor Whitty described that there was a budget of allowances and it was open to the government to decide how essentially to spend those allowances. Would you accept the government should have spent more of the social allowances in relation to children rather than focusing on matters that would have benefited adults and the economy?
I do think that should be given much greater consideration. Look, I mean, I think we're going to have to, if hopefully this thing never happens again, but if we have to do anything like this again, I think we're really going to have to consider the whole NPI system, lockdowns, whether we want to go down that route at all, particularly whether we want to close schools, because, you know, it really should be a measure of last resort. In the budget of allowances that you speak of, it should be the very last one to be spent, to be used, and we've got to find better ways of doing this.
Throughout the entire course of the pandemic, in the various measures that were taken, at no point did the government guidance ever explicitly state that children playing was considered exercise, and that parents supervising their children while playing or exercising was a valid reason to leave the house. The inquiry has heard powerful evidence from playing out in this module on this issue, including the particular difficulties for disadvantaged children, those who lacked private outdoor space. Was the impact on children's ability to play and exercise of the various rules and guidance and the disproportionate impact on disadvantaged children something that you actively considered at the time, or were you not aware of this particular problem?
Well, I certainly was aware of the particular problem of kids who didn't have access to open space, but my understanding of them, or my memory of the rules, was that you could go outside for exercise, and that applied to everybody. So I mean, forgive me if I'm misremembering something or misunderstanding your point.
The concern is that the guidance that was issued in various forms never expressly highlighted that children exercise and play very differently to adults. And
right.
So in terms of enforcement, we heard evidence, and have heard significant evidence, of children being told they couldn't be outside to play, even when they could. So was it an issue that you...
Well, that's... in that, I'm very sorry to hear that. If there was excessively officious enforcement of rules or misunderstanding of rules by those in authority, then that's plainly wrong. Children should have been... As my understanding of the rules were that children should have been allowed to exercise outdoors.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. Counsel to the inquiry asked you earlier about the lack of direct contact with children and young people, which you answered in the context of the problems with assessment grading. But children, of course, have a right to participate in all decisions affecting them under Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, they were excluded from participating in press conferences throughout the pandemic, and again our organisations and the Children's Commissioner did urge government to include children's voices, but to no avail. Would you accept it was a mistake not to allow children to participate in government press conferences throughout the pandemic?
I certainly think it was a mistake, as I've told Council to the Inquiry, for us not to find some way to interact more with children, particularly those who've been affected by the exams problems. And yes, I think that's a valid criticism. We could easily have done more there, and frankly, I don't know why we didn't.
Mr. Johnson, I'm grateful. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Broach. Mr. Jacobs over there.
Mr. Johnson, questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. You've just given evidence and been asked questions about the R budget or the budget of risk and what may be the reality in a pandemic, that if school attendance is to be prioritised, that may require other parts of society to have or face greater restrictions. In August of 2020, with an R rate mercifully below 1 but precarious, and schools about to fully open and place an upward pressure on the R rate, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme encouraged significant numbers to socialise in restaurants. Rather than manage the R budget so as to facilitate school attendance and prioritise school attendance, was that an example of the government doing the opposite?
Well, it's a very fair question. I know there's been a lot of shot and shell directed at Eat Out to Help Out over the last few years. But I've got to tell you, at the time, and this is my memory of it, at the time, my memory of it is it was discussed with the scientific advisors. My memory of it is that they did know about it. I might be wrong about that, but it seems wholly unlikely to me we would have come up with a policy that was unknown to them. And I think that it was thought to be within the budget of risk. And you know, we had an economy that was really struggling.
Mr. Johnson, you may be answering questions that Mr. Keith asked you in Module 2 about the scientific advice and what have you, which I don't want to get into. I mean, yes, in simplistic terms, a national scheme to incentivise sitting in restaurants would seem, without needing terribly significant scientific acumen, to have an upward pressure on the R rate. So on this question of prioritisation, do you think actually on reflection that was the government not prioritising facilitating school attendance?
I think it's genuinely. I think it's impossible to know. I think that's the terrible reality of all these interventions is we don't know the individual value of any of them. You know, we speak about schools being 10 to 20% or whatever, but we don't know. I think that it was felt at the time that, given where the R was, given the state of the economy, it was reasonable to proceed with Eat Out to Help Out. Would you question that in retrospect? Well, lots of people have. But what it was that actually pushed the R back over 1, who knows?
I'm going to try and deal with another topic in my time. Proactive engagement with unions and the education sector. You've been asked about a decision you made on the 6th of August 2020 to not share contingency plans. Realistically, Mr. Johnson, is that not the antithesis of having constructive and mature engagement with a sector that was responsible for educating children?
The decision was not to prevent the contingency plans from being circulated at any stage. The decision was just to hold it back until such time as we really needed to go with it. And I'm sure that the unions and the schools would have been more than capable when the moment came of rising to it and dealing with it. But I'm sure everybody remembers that at the time there was some politics in the whole question of whether schools were safe, and I thought it was important to get kids back into school and to have some forward momentum, and that was the objective.
Mr. Johnson, is it not the case that contingency planning was needed at that time? Because just as you and your government can see a fraught winter, school leaders can see a winter fraught with difficulty and having to teach in different ways, trying to support vulnerable children in very difficult circumstances. They need to be equipped.
Yes, but the contingency you're talking about is closing schools.
Well, I think it's a whole variety of contingencies, actually, that the Department of Education...
No, this particular contingency was closing schools.
I think that's my time. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Ms. Beattie, who's just there.
Mr. Johnson, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. Yes. On the 18th of March 2020, the day that you announced school closures, the COBRA meeting was informed of SAGE modelling, which assumed that schools should be kept partially open to ensure that key workers could continue to contribute to the national effort. As at 18th of March, you tell us in your statement, you had no doubt that if schools closed, it would be devastating, and you were under no illusions that it would hurt the most vulnerable the most. At the COBRA meeting, in summing up, you said that a minimal school service should be made available for the children of key workers and for vulnerable children. But the actions of the COBRA meeting were to agree a list of key workers. No actions from the meeting concerned vulnerable children. Now, Mr. Johnson, I'm sure you'll agree that actions speak louder than words. Do you agree that as at the 18th of March 2020, there should have been more focus and more action on the social care, health and therapy needs of disabled children and young people, given school closures would have an immediate and devastating impact on the provision of care and support to meet those needs?
Thank you very much. I'm sure that the department was looking at the needs of the vulnerable kids, including disabled kids, because that is spelt out in that document that I relied on so extensively to show that they were indeed mindful of the problems that they were going to encounter or they would encounter in closing schools. So,
Mr. Johnson,
what I'm trying to say is it wasn't, your question to me is, was it, why weren't we as a government taking more account of this? As far as I can tell, we were.
And so that is the paper which Council of the Inquiry took you to before of the 15th of March, the citing note, where you agreed that there was nothing of substance on vulnerable children and support and services for vulnerable children, that the paper didn't deal with that. Is that correct?
No, my impression was that it did mention vulnerable children. I don't have it before me now, but I remember it. I think it mentioned them.
It mentioned them, and it had nothing of substance. And you agreed when Ms. Dobbin put it to you earlier that it did have nothing on substance on vulnerable children. Is that right?
Well, I honestly, if that's what I don't remember saying that to Mrs. Dobbin, but perhaps I did agree with her assertion. All I can say is that if you look at that paper, it contains a reference to the needs of vulnerable children, and perhaps we could have done more, and I'm more willing to accept that there were lessons we could have learned, and more we could have done. But it struck me then that was a pretty comprehensive list of the issues that the department faced.
So it may have been a list of the issues, but what concrete measures did you put in place, or did you know were being put in place at the time to avert what you say you knew then was an immediate and devastating impact which would hurt the most vulnerable the most?
Well, as far as I can remember, the most important thing we did was to try to keep schools open. Right, that was our best answer.
Can you name anything else more specific than that?
And to make sure that in the event of closures, that all the packages available for the support of vulnerable children, disabled children in particular, were still available to them. Now, how exactly that was going to be done was clearly a matter for the relevant departments.
So, Mr Johnson, your answer seems to amount to the fact that you are taking steps to try to keep schools open. Is it in fact the case
Yes.
that the government's primary concern at that time was to make provision of a minimal school service for the children of key workers with insufficient focus on the needs of vulnerable children?
I honestly,
children?
I doubt very much that we ignored the interests of vulnerable children. I really do. But it's now so long ago that I'd have to go back over the papers and look and see what we put in place.
Nothing springs to mind.
Well, not at this stage, and not without, I'm afraid, without notice of your question. But I'd be happy to write to you.
Thank you, Ms Peachy. Mr Wagner, who's that way?
Good afternoon, Mr Johnson. I act for clinically vulnerable families. I want to ask you first about a message that you sent to Gavin Williamson on the 6th of July 2020. It is referred to at paragraph 48 of your statement. And you were asking about why school numbers, people returning to schools, seemed low. And he replied, noting that all schools were open and referring to the need to push on compulsory attendance and the message of normalcy. And you said, I encouraged him to continue the job. I just want to ask you about that message of normality. Would you agree, July 2020, this is months before the vaccine was widely available, was available at all? Do you agree?
Yes, that's right. Yes, so I think we were starting to get inklings of it quite early on. Yes,
but there was no mass testing at that stage.
No.
So would you recognise that at that stage in July 2020, for many children and young people, things couldn't go back to normal yet because they still needed to either shield to protect themselves or a clinically vulnerable member of their family living in their home?
Sure.
You referred before to Mr. Jacobs about forward momentum, about trying to sort of build forward momentum. Do you think that in that race to return to normality in that summer of 2020, clinically vulnerable families may have been left behind?
I think, on the contrary, that getting back to school, had we been able to do it in a thoroughgoing way, would have been the best thing for all children, young people, clinically vulnerable or not. Because I think that it would have restored the environment that was best able to look after them, and that it had many advantages trying to keep the schools open.
But only if they could return safely. Is that fair?
Sure, but it was my view that schools should be made as safe as possible, and if they were safe, the kids should go back.
But in schools, it wasn't always possible to enforce social distancing or have, particularly in the older buildings, good ventilation or enough space, was it?
No, it was very tricky, but the schools did a remarkable job, and one of the reasons why we staggered the return in June of 2020 was precisely because we couldn't get everybody back in at once.
But the result of that, wasn't it, that it was sometimes not safe for clinically vulnerable children or children who might take COVID back to their clinically vulnerable family members to return?
Well, I think that there was always going to be an argument against reopening schools from that position, that you were going to create a situation in which vulnerable parents would be exposed to the virus picked up by kids in schools. And that was the argument for closing schools, sure. But in the end, we had to decide whether that argument trumped the interests of the kids or not, and whether we could nonetheless get the R down below 1.
Just finally on that, I'm not actually asking about the decision to reopen schools for everybody. I'm asking about, for this specific subgroup, for clinically vulnerable children and children who lived in clinically vulnerable families. Do you understand why, at that point, many of those people will have felt it was safer to educate their children at home rather than send their children back to school?
I can see why they might have felt as they did, but clearly I thought it was best for everybody if they could get back to school, and I wanted schools to be as safe as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. That completes the questions we have for you, Mr. Johnson, apart from one from me. There are a number of people who've been making submissions and asking questions during the course of this module who believe, and there's a perception that the interests of children, well, generally, not just the loss of learning, weren't taken into account. Just putting that to one side at the moment, I haven't made any findings as yet. But if there were anything in that perception, as somebody who's got a lot of experience of working in government and, of course, leading the UK government as Prime Minister, could a Minister for Children, taking it as it away from just one government department, education, could a system of a Minister for Children work, and would it work?
I've thought about that, my lady, and I wondered about whether to create another ministerial function. I think another department, another set of civil servants, and so on. I have thought about it, and clearly there is an interest. We have a minister for women. We have all sorts of groups represented. I think, given how much we've heard today about the Department of Education's desire to keep proper desire to keep schools open and to represent the interests of children and young people, I think on the whole I would apply Occam's razor to this one, and I would probably keep it with DFE. Because I think that in the end the parents should be responsible for children, is what I would say. Maybe an old-fashioned view, but that's what I would say.
But the interests of children cross government departments, don't they? So, for example, detained children would be Home Office.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. Look, I'm not.
You're not.
I'm not remotely hostile to the idea. I just think you've got to think very hard before you create new departments, divisions, new roles in government. We've seen already throughout this debate, how fractious and difficult it becomes when different ministerial interests start to collide, and we've got quite enough around the table on a subject like this. That's what I would say.
That completes the questions we have for you, therefore, Mr. Johnson, and that completes the assistance that you're going to have to give the inquiry.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I think you did that last time too. I think you're obviously in a great rush to leave me.
Sorry, it's like when the speaker stands up at the end of PMQs, you just run for it. That's what.
Understood.
Sorry.
I appreciate you didn't intend any discourtesy.
Sorry, forgive me.
No, don't worry.
Forgive me.
Anyway, thank you very much indeed for the help that you've given to the inquiry. That's it.
Thank you so much, my name.
Thank you. I shall return at 5 to 2.
All rise.
Department of Education said, there not being enough planning before the closure of schools back in March 2020. We heard today quotes from other people who worked in the Department of Education saying that they weren't asked to come up with contingency plans before their announcement of the closure of schools in March 2020. Boris Johnson there today very firmly coming back and saying he disagreed with those accounts and talked about how there was planning for school closures in terms of conversations with SAGE, scientific advisors. That hearing had been discussed a lot in cabinet as well. So he really said that he did remember it being discussed, that the Department of Education was discussing it, and almost that it was almost assumed that they were doing something about it. Previously, the Department of Education said we hadn't been specifically told to come up with a contingency plan. So a lot has been said. There's plenty more summaries on our website. Feel free to all of them. Reviews finished. Well done.
That was good for them.
Yeah. Right, if he comes out, where am I dumping? That down here. Do you want to next side? If it starts to fall, just grab this to cover it. Thanks.
Mark, you just gonna far from here, or just go for a coffee? Stay at the station. There's a Costa. It's only 5 minute walk. But there's no rush. Yeah, we'll just go there. I mean, I'm tempted to even just jump on the Bakerloo line and do it there. Yeah, because I'll go home. I'm not far, but I might go across there.
shout when I've got it.
Well, turn it up gently.
Yeah.
There's the volume. I'll let you adjust to.
Can't hear anything right
Oh,
now.
no, really? I can. No. I could. You know, that was all there.
Oh yeah, and then we've got.
Yeah, sticky stick might tooth me.
Yeah. Hi. Okay. 10 past. Yeah. Okay, you're very quiet. I'm probing just so you know.
I'm sorry.
If you want me to, I love that. I should eat you a line. Instead to one side. So just one shopping trolley. Yeah.
Do you mind sideways like that?
No, I don't. Because I just think then if someone tells me, if you tell me, I just need something in my eye line.
I'll go.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And then I will
understand why at times
away
emotions
and get another
running
shot
higher
and then step back in.
going out of the inquiry room. He was in tears.
No, just to cover our backs.
A member of your Boris families here to bear witness to Boris Johnson's testimony, and this is we're at the phase 8 module of the long-running inquiry.
I know that so well.
Children and young people, and of course, at the time and in hindsight, for many years since, one of the most controversial elements of the way the government responded, one of the aspects of lockdown, was the decision to
I won't pivot like that.
Very
And then I'll keep my left foot in place.
children and young people, particularly their mental
No, years on the.
their education. Some of the themes that we picked up today, of course, was around that initial decision to close schools en masse in March 2020. Also the issues around the way exams were issued, ranging from the use of controversial algorithms in the summer of 2020, and then that following year, right at the start of 2021, the flip-flopping between reopening and then suddenly pulling the rug away from the students and teachers and schools closing caps just today. All these and more came up today. Now, Boris Johnson stressed that the closure of schools he always saw as a nightmare scenario. But we have heard previously in sessions here at the Covid inquiry criticism levelled towards him, towards the government, for the lack, apparently, of planning towards for that potential possibility of schools having to close. We knew the pandemic was spreading around the world. Former Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson, for example, has criticised Number 10 for moving too slowly. And the former Department for Education Schools Director General as well, Sir Jim Coles, he actually claimed it was an extraordinary dereliction of duty of the Department for Education to have not planned for school closures sooner than March 2020. This is something Boris Johnson denied here today, that language certainly, saying he had assumed the language would have made it clear to the Department for Education that school closures were a potential possibility for it. We also heard about the algorithm, that decision to downgrade exam results in the summer of 2020. Boris Johnson actually at times getting quite touchy there. He described it all as a disaster, but it was a really difficult thing to try and manage. And we saw those WhatsApp messages
We're waiting for Boris Johnson to lead the COVID inquiry in the building behind me, having completed his testimony this morning. This is the last time he will be called in. The main subject of this morning was school closures, although he also faced questions about why he didn't fully fund the recovery programme for children and their education that he had invited Kevin Collins to put in place for them, which would have included extra time and extra activities. He said that he thought it just wasn't justified and that he wanted to concentrate his efforts on tutoring. But what was most striking was the glimpse we got into the tensions at the heart of the government. Last week we saw an expletive-filled message from Gavin Williamson. Today, Boris Johnson saying he wanted ministers at the Department for Education to be sacked, saying we cannot go on like this.
You've got a card in stream. Yes.
As he comes out. Yeah. I'll take my...
It's not till quarter past.
Okay. We'll just see how it goes. You've got to see the live one.
I think it's streaming anyway.
I'm going to take
They're
my
quite good at holding.
just to be a bit more freedom. Give me
not like it's real.
I was hoping he'd come out.
Cards are coming.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah.
I just rolled on.
Yeah, I'm rolled. Just let it start from him or just keep it wide?
I can start from him, so I'll start with Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, leaving. Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, leading the COVID inquiry, having given testimony for the last time. He said at the end that he thought it was the right decision at the time to close schools, but he accepted that it had awful consequences for many young people.
Very impressive. Don't come to that. Sorry, can you go back inside?
Get a new pen. Free card.
Rachel! I knew he was going to do what he did. It's a shame. This is, are you still at school? Okay. I don't know. I don't know. Oh, she wanted to make sure she thought I was the security threat. Anyway. Yeah, how many weeks have you? I thought you weeks. Oh, so you're not over now. So Rachel used to be at LBC. She was my main contact there. How many years ago now was that? So, yes, right. Was it? No, yeah. Before the actual inquest, we were there. Yeah.
I'm Rachel, sorry.
Yeah, Rachel Benville. She used to do what Henry Riley does now.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Henry does what
Yes.
you do now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's far more stunts than
I know. Congratulations to you and hubby. I feel like I've seen you before when you got married. Oh wow. Right. Yeah, I think he's going to come back. But they all went in and they said he didn't apologise, he didn't do anything. Blah, blah. but I knew he was going to do. She warned me that he's going to repeat the